Well, we're currently in the middle of a government-imposed lockdown. It's a sentence I never thought I'd start a sermon of mine with, but nevertheless, that's the state that we find ourselves in. That's where we find ourselves, in isolation from one another. For many people, this time is actually a very difficult time, not being able to see friends or family, people that we love. For many people, the days are very long and perhaps lonely. For lots of people, the only social interaction they're getting is doing the daily Joe Wicks PE activities. Nearly 1 million people are joining in from around the world because they're on lockdown. They're isolated from one another, and yet they're finding some sort of interaction, some sense of community by doing PE together. Now, of course, in many ways, we're very fortunate that this lockdown is happening at a time when we have technology available. We have things like Zoom, YouTube that you're watching this on now, FaceTime, even phone calls are helpful to some extent, aren't they, in relieving some of the difficult circumstances that we're in. But nevertheless, we know that those things are no substitute for the real thing, for gathering together, for being together, for being with people. And for many, these days in isolation, in lockdown, away from each other, are very difficult days. Perhaps you're feeling that. Perhaps you're feeling down and sad about the situation that we find ourselves in. And on top of that, there's the worry about the virus itself. Perhaps you're worried that you might get coronavirus. Perhaps you're worried about those that you know and those people that you love. Perhaps even you know people that have had coronavirus, or perhaps even you know people who've sadly died from the virus. We're in very difficult times as a country, as a nation. And as we look around the world, as we look around our country, it's easy to feel down. It's easy to feel a bit blue, a bit sad about all that we're experiencing. If that is the case, if we are feeling perhaps down, perhaps sad about what we're experiencing, that is something of what the prophet Jeremiah experienced when he wrote the book of Lamentations. Just look at the passage in front of us. Jeremiah says this, verse 19. I remember my affliction and my wandering, the bitterness and the gall. I well remember them, and my soul is downcast within me. He says his soul is downcast. He's feeling down, he's feeling blue, he's feeling sad about what he's going through. Now, of course, Jeremiah's situation was a little bit different to ours. They didn't have coronavirus back then. At least Jeremiah probably wasn't tested for coronavirus. But Lamentations begins in chapter 1 verse 1 by a lament of the deserted city. The city had become isolated. There was death, pain, suffering, hunger in the streets. And Jeremiah looks at what's going on in the country, looks at what people are facing, and he feels down. His soul is downcast within him, he says. It's a reminder to us that if we are feeling downcast, it's okay to be honest about that. We don't have to pretend that everything is okay. But Jeremiah doesn't stay downcast. Jeremiah has hope. Just look at the very next verse. Verse 21, yet this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. Jeremiah moves from despondency, from despair, from being downcast to having hope. How does he move from being down to having hope? Well, he tells us, verse 21, he calls this to mind. So what's the this that Jeremiah is calling to mind? How does he move from being down to having hope? Well, he goes on to explain it. Verse 22. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. You see, Jeremiah moves from feeling down to having hope by remembering the love of God. It's God's love. That's the thing that moves Jeremiah from feeling down to having hope. It's thinking about the love of God. Now, I appreciate as we talk about the love of God, as we look around the world around us, As we think about all the suffering that we see on our streets, as we think about those in our community who perhaps have lost loved ones, perhaps are going through very difficult times, it may be hard for us to reconcile the pain, the suffering, the difficulties in the world with the love of God. How do we reconcile those two things? In many ways, there are no easy answers to that question. It's a question which all people have to wrestle with. How can this world exist with so much pain and suffering in it? It's a question that not just Christians have to wrestle with, but people of all faiths and no faith. And yet, whilst the Bible doesn't give us easy answers, it does tell us some things. It tells us that this broken world that we live in, this world that is often marked by pain, by suffering, by anxiety, by worry, by viruses, this world is broken and corrupted, and we long for it to be different, don't we? We long for a world that is free from viruses, free from pain and suffering. And God says to us that one day that world will come. One day when Jesus returns from on high and we are taken to be in a new world, for all those who have trusted in Jesus, they will receive a world free from pain, free from worry, free from death. All because of the love of God. But of course, at times like this, it can be hard to really believe those things. How can we be sure that God loves us? How can we be sure that this is the hope that we have if we put our trust in Jesus? Well, let me tell you a little story. It's about a chap called Giuseppe Berardelli. He was a Roman Catholic priest who lived in northern Italy recently, and he developed coronavirus. The man was in his 70s, and his parishioners bought him a respirator. But when he went into hospital, he didn't use the respirator. He gave his respirator away to someone who was much younger than him, a younger man who he had never met before. Well, Giuseppe Berardelli died. He died because he gave his respirator away. He gave his life so that someone else might be saved. He sacrificed himself. In fact, in many senses, that's what our NHS staff are doing. They're putting themselves in harm's way. They're putting themselves in danger so that we can be cared for, so that we can be protected. They're sacrificing themselves. The story of sacrifice is, in very many senses, the story at the centre of the human story, the centre of the world. Because at the heart of it all is a God who has sent his own Son. For God so loved the world that he gave his own Son. The Son so loved us that he gave his own life, and the Holy Spirit pours out that love in our hearts if we trust in Jesus. In many senses, the story at the centre of everything is the story of sacrifice, the story of laying down someone's life for their friends, a sign of love. The God of the Bible is a God who is full of love, who has demonstrated that love at the cross where Jesus died. You see, God doesn't just say that he loves us, but does nothing about it. No, God shows his love. He demonstrates his love by giving us his Son. Jesus demonstrates his love by dying on the cross for all that we have done wrong. See, God shows his love to us. But you know what? One of the things I find most extraordinary about this passage in Lamentations is what Jeremiah then goes on to say. He says in the very next verse, verse 23, God's compassions are new every morning. I find that extraordinary. God's compassion, his kindness, his grace to us is not just 2,000 years ago at the cross. It is not just when we become a Christian. It is new every single morning. God's compassions are new. Moment by moment, bit by bit, fresh grace for us. God's compassion, his heart, his kindness, his love is new to us every single morning. Now, I think that's really important in our current situation, because every single morning we find ourselves with challenges, don't we? We wake up and we're again in lockdown. Perhaps we have less food than we previously had. Perhaps we look at the news and we see there's a fresh crisis. There's the death toll rising, more bad news on the way. Or maybe you've started, like we have, homeschooling the children, and every day is a challenge, and you've come to realize that teachers ought to be paid a lot more than they are currently paid. Perhaps you've come to realize that. Every day is difficult. There are challenges every single day. Or perhaps as you think about things, you think, well, you know what? I'm not sure that I can manage in isolation for months on end. I'm not sure I've got it in me to be cooped up like this and to be away from my friends and my family. I don't think I can cope. There are challenges meeting us every single day, but this passage says God's compassion meets us every single day. God's compassions are new every single morning. Isn't that wonderful news? Whilst there are difficulties every day, God's compassion, His mercy is fresh to us, bit by bit, little by little, helping us every single morning. Now that's really good news. I hope you're encouraged by that. I certainly have been, as I've been thinking about it this week. But if we're honest, sometimes it's very difficult to let that to sink in. We can sort of know that intellectually in our minds, but it's hard to let that sink into us. It's hard for us to really experience the truth of that. But again, this is where this passage is really helpful, because this passage says we need to speak to ourselves. Just look again at what the passage says. Jeremiah says in verse 21, "This I call to mind." In verse 24, he says, "I say to myself, the Lord is my portion, therefore I will wait for him." You see, Jeremiah speaks to himself. He calls things to mind. He speaks to himself. Now, I know that they say that it's a sign of madness to talk to yourself. But if you're in isolation, particularly if you live on your own, I bet you have started talking to yourself by now, haven't you? Perhaps you talk to the cat or the dog or the plants or whatever. It's not a sign of madness to talk to yourself. It's actually a sign of maturity. It's actually a sign of spiritual maturity to talk to yourself. The prophet Jeremiah does it. He talks to himself. He reminds himself of truth. You see, every single day we listen. We listen to ourselves. We listen to our feelings, our emotions. We listen to the news which is bombarding us with information. And yet this passage says we ought to speak to ourselves. We ought to speak, to remind ourselves of truth, and not just to listen to all the stuff that's coming at us, but to speak the truth. To speak the truth to ourselves when we're in those situations. Very practically, I find it helpful at the moment in the middle of lockdown, before I put the news on, before I see all that's happening in the world, to remind myself of who God is, to remind myself that God is the King, to remind myself that He loves me, that He cares for me, that His compassion is new for me every day. Perhaps practically that's making sure we read the Bible before we put the news on, or do anything else in the day. I find it very helpful to be listening to a worship song before I've done anything else, to put it into perspective before we go on to do the rest of the day, to speak the truth to ourselves and not just to listen to all that's happening. And finally, as we come towards a close, there's something very important that we also need to do. It's how Jeremiah finishes this little bit in verse 24. He says this, "Yet this I call to mind," and verse 24, "I say to myself, the Lord is my portion, therefore I will wait for him." We need to wait on the Lord. You see, it's not just to speak to ourselves, for us to do things. We need to look outwards. We need to look to God. We need to depend on Him and to wait on Him. Now, we need to call out to Him, to pray, to persist in praying, particularly at this time. Now, we don't know when this virus will end. We don't know when we'll be able to go back out to the shops properly again. We don't know when we'll be able to meet again physically as a church. But we do know something. We do know that God is in control. We do know that we have a certain hope of his love because he sent his own Son for us. We do know that God is sovereign over everything. And we do know that he cares and that his compassion is new to us every single day. Whilst we have lots of questions and lots of things that we're wrestling with, we do know some truths. We do know that God is in control and that he loves us. And we need to speak, reminding ourselves of those things and calling out to God in prayer, waiting on him before he acts. And so as we're in isolation away from one another, we're of course not away from God. We're not in isolation from him. We're with him. He's with us every day. He is everywhere. And so let us use this as an opportunity to persist, to call out to God, to wait on him and to persist in prayer. After all, God promises that he is our portion, and therefore, Jeremiah says, he will wait on him.